Hello, everyone. Dr. Yonit Arthur here. You are on The Steady Coach, and I am very excited today to bring you this extremely informative and helpful interview with Tanner Murtagh. Tanner is a registered social worker and psychotherapist, and he is the director of Pain Psychotherapy Canada. Tanner is a specialist in helping people with chronic, medically unexplained physical symptoms like chronic pain, chronic dizziness, chronic fatigue, and other symptoms. In this video, Tanner is going to teach us all about polyvagal theory and nervous system safety. We're going to learn what that even means. We're going to learn why this is an essential element to recovering from chronic dizziness and any other chronic physical symptom. And Tanner's going to give you some ideas about how you can start working on this beyond the simple breathwork exercises that I've talked about on my channel and somatic tracking, which I'm sure many of you have tried. You're going to get a lot out of this interview, so if you enjoy it, please let me know. Please comment, please share this video, please subscribe to my channel if you're watching this on YouTube, or if you are listening to this as a podcast, please consider leaving us a 5-star review and following this podcast. All of those things help me reach more people. Please enjoy. All right, Tanner, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you here. I'm as I was saying off air, I'm really excited to dig into our topic today. But before we do that, would you mind just telling us a little bit about how you got into working with mind-body disorders?
Yeah, so a little bit about me, how I got into this, and I'm very passionate on the topic as we've discussed previously. But for myself, I did have like pretty widespread chronic pain. This was several years ago. And I think like a lot of people and probably a lot of listeners, like I did the normal medical treatments. I, got scans, got everything kind of figured out. I was given lots of different diagnoses, but none of the treatments were helping. So I was in widespread chronic pain for probably like 3.5 years. And then very fortunately came to a mind body approach. I think like a lot of people, it started with Dr. Sarno's stuff. I read one of his books. Dr. Schubiner, I read his book on Learn Your Pain and using those techniques. And of course, I'm a therapist, so I had a bit of an edge using some of the techniques psychologically, but was able to fully recover in a number of months. And so because of that, I'm very passionate and very committed to this. And hence why I started up in Canada. That's why I started my company. And we provide, treatment for mental health mind-body concerns that are taking place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And I'll definitely, again, we'll be saying this at the end as well, but I'll be linking to your YouTube channel and your website as well, so people can look you up. Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. So, okay. So you run your practice about mind-body disorders. You help people with mind-body disorders. Do you see people with dizziness? We want to know, is it just pain, or what are you seeing?
Yeah. So I think it's a mix of things that we see. Initially, when I started my therapy agency, we really were focused on pain. And personally, that's what I recovered from. So that's why I kind of targeted that. But what I was seeing is that there was a whole bunch of other conditions and concerns taking place that all of a sudden we were starting to treat as well. So I think after kind of chronic pain, we're dealing with chronic fatigue, brain fog symptoms. That's a really common one. And then probably shortly after that, the next big concerns are dizziness, things like tinnitus. And, we've also dealt with more severe things like psychogenic seizures and different things of that nature. Wow. So it is a mix. I think as my practice has kind of grown, we've adapted to include all of these things because mind-body concerns, they can present a lot of different ways for people. They really can. Well, we think about, the brain has full control. The brain has full control, so it can produce really any symptom or sensation that we're going to experience. And of course, dizziness being a really common one that's out there that people are struggling with, and that the normal medical care really isn't providing much relief sometimes.
Okay. Amen to that. Yeah,
Yeah.
very true. So, because people here on my channel are going to want to know if you've seen their diagnoses, can you speak to the kinds of dizziness diagnoses you've seen, like vestibular migraine, PPPD, MDDS? Are those diagnoses that you see frequently?
Yeah, those three that you mentioned are really the ones that I'm frequently seeing, and I know this is what you deal with a lot.
All we do. Yes.
Yeah, I think the most common one that I've come across is PPPD.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably the thing that I see the most often,
Yes.
and have had good results with for some people. But
Yeah.
the other two that you mentioned, like, they are common
Mm-hmm.
occurrences. And I think the other thing is they're common occurrences with pain or fatigue. A lot of times it's not kind of secular with one or the other. I think for a lot of people, similar to myself, over time, as my mind body concerns went on and on untreated, I got more and more symptoms. So it really spreads. Like even think about tinnitus. I started to get that closer to the end of my journey. But for a lot of people, it's not just one area or one symptom. It starts to spread more and more the longer it goes untreated. And the more fear we start to develop about our body being damaged or there being something really physically wrong with us.
Very well stated. Very well stated.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you spoke to that too, because as you said, frequently people with dizziness come in with such a long list of symptoms that they can't believe that it could all be related. Like they play symptom whack-a-mole. It's like, well, this is the dizziness related stuff, but then I also have this back pain. I also have this neck pain. I also have this and that. But what you're pointing out is frequently when all of these things are co-occurring, it's really all the same syndrome.
Yeah. And I think it's also good evidence what's taking place too. Like the more and more symptoms you get, because a lot of people early on, they're getting systemic disorders ruled out pretty quick. Mm-hmm. Like the medical system's pretty good at understanding if those are taking place or not. And so the more symptoms you get, the more likely it becomes that this is a brain and nervous system issue that's taking place. And that's what's responsible for these symptoms being produced. And that was a big thing, even when I was recovering, that really bought me in, is it wasn't like I just had pain in my knees. It was all over the place. There was all these different symptoms going on. And the longer and longer I tried to figure this out with doctors, physicians, practitioners, nothing major was being found that really explained all of these different symptoms happening. And I think for a lot of people, that's the journey that they go on. I like that you said it's kind of like whack-a-mole. I think that is what happens, is we're just trying to treat all these symptoms in different ways, but we miss that there is like this underlying cause that the brain and nervous system is just in survival mode, and it's feeling chronically in danger for a variety of different reasons. But that's really what's going on underneath.
Yes, and which is a beautiful seg into the topic that I really want to talk to you about. So you mentioned a few minutes ago that fear and anxiety about the symptoms are playing a role here. We know this. So why does that not fully explain things for some people? So in other words, I see people go through CBT, for example, or really shift their mindsets and just dramatically reduce their fear related to symptoms. When is that not enough, and why?
Yeah. And it's a complex question, because everyone's very different. And I'm sure you've experienced this with your own practice. Everyone's very different of what clicks for them. So when I'm working with someone, I have a general roadmap of things that I think are pretty important that we touch on. And, but I don't know exactly what's going to be most effective for some people. And when we talk about CBT, that's very much a top-down approach. right? That's what's taking place. We're trying to change our cognitions. We're trying to change our mental processes, and then that having an effect on our emotional state, our nervous system, our felt sense. And this was the narrative for decades that we did in therapy, long before even I was born. This is what we were doing. And for some people, that can be very effective for lots of different concerns, not just mind body issues, but you talk about anxiety, depression, different things. But I think a lot of research now is showing that more and more it's bottom up that needs to take place, right? That we actually change the state of our nervous system, that we work with emotions in the body somatically. And then as a result, the story in our mind actually starts to change greatly. There's a famous therapist named Deb Dana that does a lot of polyvagal stuff that we're going to talk about today. But she has this line where she says, like, story follows state. So, and that goes very in contradiction to, change your thoughts, everything will be okay. Like, it's the understanding that we need to change the state of our nervous system, that we need to work with emotion. And then the story starts to shift. And of course, it goes both ways. I don't want to be extreme here and say it's not one or the other, but I think more often it's going bottom up for a lot of people. And so, like, when I'm working with people, it's, again, like, we need to focus on our thoughts, on our beliefs about the symptoms. This is why, mind-body education needs to happen. Like, we need to have that information and start to change our beliefs and change our thoughts, because that can create safety. And it really can. If we start to believe, like, hey, my body's actually okay, it makes sense. That's going to create a sense of safety. And for lots of people, that can reduce fear greatly. It's not the full package, but that's a starting place of it. And then, it's thinking about changing the emotional response to the symptoms. This is what pain reprocessing therapy really focuses on as well. You change the emotional response to the symptoms. And that can be really effective for people, as emotionally in their body, they stop having so much of a sense of danger around the symptoms. But I think even that can't be enough sometimes. And I know with a lot of your work, it comes down to processing emotions. Like, we need to do that. We need to learn to sit with our emotions, be with them, actually have a sense of safety with them in the body. And only then can we stop having these serial symptoms taking place. Because even for myself, at times when I stopped taking emotional care of myself, at times when I, was basically living neck up again, that's where symptoms started to happen again. Mm-hmm. And so there needs to be this sense of safety with emotions. And a big part that I focus on as well is processing trauma, if people have trauma, but also regulating the nervous system. We need to have a sense of safety in our nervous system so that mind-body concerns don't keep happening or keep being perpetuated. And, the last thing that I always talk about with people is creating social safety. I'm a social worker by trade, so we talk about this a lot, but it is creating social safety. Like, if you look at, systemic issues in our society, like if you look at poverty, if you look at racism, if you look at things like, the adversities that the LGBTQ plus community faces, their rates of chronic pain, for example, are much higher. And it's not that their bodies are more damaged. That's not what's taking place. It's just that in our society as a whole, there's a lack of safety that's taking place. And that's, a big part of it, even with our relationships. If you're in a home where there's toxic relationships that you don't feel socially safe, it's going to be really hard to make changes take place, because your nervous system is just detecting cues of danger over and over and over again. Even for myself, when I recovered, like, there was friends that I cut out of my life, and for good reason. And that was a big part in creating a sense of safety in the world that I was living in. Anyways, that was my long answer to that question, but it gives you a sense that it's more than just thoughts and beliefs, right?
Yes. So, this really, what you answered is a question I get asked quite frequently. Yonit, I'm telling myself I'm safe, and I don't believe myself. So
Yeah.
all of the things that you're talking about are things that need to be modified, because if you don't feel safe in your body, if your nervous system doesn't feel safe, of course, you're not going to believe yourself when you just say the words. It's not about the words. It's about actually creating, like you said, a felt sense of safety in your body.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. And that's the thing is, in pain reprocessing therapy, they talk about messages of safety. This is a
Yes.
common thing lots of people know.
Yes.
And I'm
Messages of
not
safety.
against them. They
Yes.
can be very effective,
Yes.
but we need to pair them with creating a sense of safety in the body. Because again, a lot of that communication of cues of safety or danger is coming bottom up, right? It's coming bottom up where we create a sense of safety in our body. And then those messages of safety, those cognitive messages of safety, they're going to land way easier.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's almost like if there's a dissonance between them, then you're going to be a lot less likely to actually be able to feel safe. But if there's an alignment, if you're giving yourself cognitive messages of safety and there are messages of safety around you, a felt sense of safety, as we've talked about, it's going to create more safety overall.
Yeah, I totally agree that it's not just the thoughts and beliefs. Of course, I'm not telling people don't do that stuff, because that can be important and really impactful. But that's going to land easier for people. Like if people experiencing mind-body concerns feel a low amount of stress in their life, they feel safe at work, or school, they feel safe in their family. And, they just got into this pattern of starting to fear the symptoms. For that population, I find that changing your thoughts and beliefs can really click.
Yes.
And it works beautifully. This is where pain reprocessing therapy can work great for symptoms. But if people are very dysregulated in their nervous system, it's not going to land. It's not the full picture. Right. If we can create regulation in the nervous system and that felt sense of safety, then all of a sudden those top-down approaches are going to click way easier for people.
Right. And when you're speaking to one of the particular difficulties specifically for dizziness, because dizziness or vestibular problems in general hack the fight or flight system. So in and of themselves, even if someone doesn't have a mind-body syndrome, having dizziness is very dysregulating. So add what was probably already a dysregulated nervous system, which we're going to talk about, because I have some questions about the background of people who end up with chronic symptoms. But you add that to the fact that the symptoms themselves also cause this dysregulation, and it's just a recipe for chronic symptoms with dizziness.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I've seen that, and that happens. It's this really negative feedback loop that starts taking place with dizziness, with other symptoms as well, where it creates more of a sense of danger. It dysregulates them further, and then it just perpetuates it on and on.
Yeah. Okay, so give us some hope. You mentioned you mentioned just a few minutes ago, if we can create a sense of safety. So what I'm hearing is this is a modifiable variable. This is something you can work on. This is something you can help create, as you said, from the bottom up.
Yeah. I do believe that. And lots of research shows that we can get to a regulated place. No, I think the starting place is understanding what we're talking about when we say dysregulated nervous system.
Yes.
And regulated nervous system, because there is some myths here that people fall victim to. Okay. So when we talk about a dysregulated nervous system, it's a nervous system that isn't flexible. It's not flexible. So what that means is it gets locked into these defense states. And I'll talk about the three systems of the nervous system in a bit here. But when we talk about defense states, fight, flight, freeze, shutdown, going into these periodically, everyone's going to do that. That's not a big deal. It's not the end of the world. Like even this morning, I had this big plan. Okay. I was like, okay, I got some time before I meet with Yonit. I'm going to go to the coffee shop. I'm going to drink my coffee, work on my computer. I had this beautiful plan in my mind. And I got to the coffee shop. And this was after, you know, I have a new puppy and the puppy peed on the floor. So I'm like cleaning it up. So I'm already running late. I get to the coffee shop. I don't have my wallet, right? I don't have my wallet. So I go back. I was in a bit of fight. Like I felt frustrated. And that's normal. That doesn't mean that you have a really dysregulated nervous system, because my nervous system over time has become regulated where I started to go into this fight response. And then I moved back up to a safe and connected state. And so when we talk about a regulated nervous system, it's one that's flexible. And so it's not getting into these defense states for a prolonged period of time, because you're going to go into defense states sometimes. That's going to happen. We're meant to do that as human beings. And if it's not prolonged, it's not going to escalate mind-body symptoms. It's when we're in these prolonged states of danger or survival mode for a prolonged period of time, that's where symptoms start to escalate. But this morning, it wasn't extreme, but I went into this fight response. It's not like all my pain just came back. And so a regulated nervous system isn't one that's just calm all the time. Deb Dana talks about how it's flexible. And that's what we're going for, is that by regulating our nervous system over time, it becomes more flexible where it can be fluid and move between the systems.
Excellent point. We want people to be able to respond with that fight response when appropriate. If a car's flying down the road and you're in the way, we want you to get that shot of adrenaline and get out of the way, right?
Yeah.
So I'm so glad you spoke to that misconception, because I think people misunderstand and think they're trying to get themselves to be calm all the time. And that's exactly not what you're talking about, which is
that's not. Again, calmness is important. We want to work towards that. But what happens for people is they actually start to suppress emotional responses a lot of the time. And that's going to just escalate mind-body symptoms. If we ever want to escalate dizziness, pain, fatigue, just start to push down emotions that you're feeling. And so that's the misconception that I want to be clear about, is it's not that we're trying to get you to always just be calm. That's not how we're meant to be as human beings. We're meant to be able to have a lot of energy in our system and also have less energy and be able to tolerate that. That's what we're going for as we regulate the nervous system, so that it's able to fluidly move between lots of energy and less energy. Peter Levine talks about this, where we're moving between lots of energy and less energy. The problem when we have a very dysregulated nervous system is it gets locked. It's like, or it gets locked and shut down. So it's going like too high or too low and just stuck there. And so there's no fluidity in the way it's functioning.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So could we say a word here before you go on and start talking about the states, the nervous system states? Can you say a word here about how this leads to physical symptoms when the nervous system is inflexible?
Yeah. So really, when you understand when it's not flexible, you're going to get locked into fight or flight, freeze, or shutdown mode for a long period of time. And when that takes place, your nervous system is basically in a state of danger and survival mode. And kind of like how Alan Gordon talks about how pain is a danger signal. That's like a quote that he says a lot. Mm-hmm. That's what's happening. Like if your nervous system's in a state of danger, your brain is just going to start to produce these symptoms because it's a protective mechanism. I think about the symptoms as meaningful messages. I think it's a useful way to change the way we view them. They're meaningful messages. That's what they are. They're not happening by mistake a lot of the time. They're meaningful messages that our brain is letting us know, like, hey, you've been stuck in survival mode, danger mode for too long. And now we're producing symptoms. It's no different than anxiety in my mind. And when I go into explaining the systems, we'll kind of see how the different symptoms can play out depending on what state that we're in consistently. But that's what it is. It's a meaningful message that our brain is sending us that we've been in a state of danger. We're almost in a detected state of life threat for too long.
Yes. And in doing so, the brain starts to misattribute normal, it starts to attribute danger to either normal sensation or normal activities. It thinks everything. It starts generalizing that perceived danger to other things, to normal sensations and to normal activities, and what become triggers.
Yes, a miscommunication starts to take place between the body and the brain. So safe signals are going up, being like, we're all good, everything's fine. But unfortunately, the brain, because it's in a state of survival mode, your nervous system being in a state of survival mode, it's just not accurately detecting sensations from the body anymore, signals from the body. And so we start to get all sorts of symptoms taking place, dizziness being one of them.
Yes. Okay. And I just wanted to make a note on what you said about anxiety. So you mentioned, I don't see it as different from anxiety, but I understand the distinction. I just want to point this out to people. We're not saying that the symptoms are just anxiety.
No. Yeah.
We're saying that the mechanism that causes anxiety is the same mechanism as the one that causes physical symptoms, but the symptoms are not just anxiety. They are the same. They have the same root cause.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction to make. And yeah, like I view it in the sense of the systems within our nervous system. You know, if we're in that fight, flight, or freeze, we can experience anxiety. We can experience pain. We can experience other symptoms taking place. But yeah, it's not just anxiety, as you said.
Yeah. And a distinction that I think is more important for some than others, because one of the risk factors for developing chronic dizziness in particular is having had previous anxiety, but many people didn't. Many people didn't. And that's going to bring us to one of the questions I'm going to ask you later. But coming back, you were just about to tell us more about the 3 states. So now I'll stop asking side questions and get us back.
That's all right. Okay. I'll explain this. So when we talk about the nervous system, we're talking about polyvagal theory. And polyvagal theory, it was developed by Dr. Stephen Porges, and Deb Dana is another therapist who's quite well versed in it and has developed a lot of techniques that I utilize. But polyvagal theory, it's the science of safety and connection and regulating the nervous system. That's what it is. And so even before we talk about, you know, the three systems at play within our nervous system, a concept that is from polyvagal theory is called neuroception. Now, not everyone will know what this means, so I'll explain it.
Please.
We all know what perception is. We perceive things cognitively. So we're perceiving things in our environment. We're perceiving things in our body. It's very conscious. We're picking up cues of safety or danger. But neuroception is something different. It's the idea that your nervous system, unconscious to you, is picking up cues of safety or danger really quick from your external world, from internally in your body, from other relationships, other people's nervous systems. It's automatically picking up cues of safety or danger. Now, when neuroception is working well, it's accurate, meaning that it's accurately picking up cues of safety or danger. That happens. The problem is when we experience trauma, chronic stress, or we start to experience mind-body issues, our neuroception starts to become inaccurate. So it's starting to pick up on cues of danger in safe situations. It's starting to pick up on sensations in your body as dangerous when they're actually safe. So it's very in line with what we're talking about. When neuroception goes off, it becomes very messy because your nervous system is always picking up on cues of danger, even if it's actually in a safe environment. Now, it can even go the opposite way. This is just more a funny side note, but some people's neuroception is inaccurate the opposite way, where they're picking up on cues of safety when there's actually cues of danger, which is dangerous. Like years back when I was in my early 20s, I had this drummer that was in a band I was playing in. And he was the most laid back person I think I will ever meet. He was just chill constantly. And his neuroception was actually inaccurate the opposite way, where he always just thought things were safe and fine. Even when like his life was kind of messy and there was some danger that was going on that he probably needed to deal with. So I know for a lot of people with mind body issues, we're jealous of those people, but it can go the opposite way.
It can, and that's why they don't end up with mind body syndrome.
Yeah, that guy, I can promise he will never have mind body issues without a doubt. But you get the idea of neuroception that's taking place. And so when we talk about, our nervous system, we talk about the hierarchy of the autonomic nervous system. So it's a hierarchy. There's 3 systems at play. Now, first off, there's 2 pathways in your nervous system. Most people know this. There's the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. But within those two pathways, we have 3 systems. And Deb Dana talks about them as like a hierarchy. So one's on top of the other. And that's important because we shift within that in that way. So at the very top, we have what's called the ventral-vagal system. Now, this is where everyone wants to be. This is where you feel safe. You feel connected. A good sign you're in a ventral-vagal state is you want to socially engage. You want to connect with people. You want to connect with the world. You can feel calm, at ease. It can be you can find purpose there where you're very purposeful and productive. It can be even things when we talk about ventral-vagal, there can be an element of playfulness to that state. And at the extreme end of ventral-vagal, you can have almost euphoric happiness that's taking place. Now, you're not going to be there all the time, but our goal is to increase kind of the ventral-vagal energy within a person's system, so they have more of this safe and connected energy taking place. Now, what happens is if our nervous system accurately or inaccurately starts to pick up on cues of danger, we shift down to the next system. And this is the sympathetic system. Now, your sympathetic system, lots of people understand this as fight or flight. It's not just fight or flight. It mobilizes us. And that's important. Even as we're talking right now, I can feel sympathetic energy. I'm explaining something that I'm passionate about. There is some sympathetic energy taking place. I just have some of the ventral-vagal going on as well, where I also feel at ease. But with sympathetic, what happens is people can go into these defense states. So if you go far enough into it, you start to get that fight or flight. Now, for myself, at the mild end, it's irritation, like I was talking about this morning. It can be nervousness. But at the extreme end, you're getting extreme panic or rage. And what happens very quickly is changes happening in your body. Your breath becomes really sharp and shallow. Your heart rate increases. People can become shaky even. And when we're in a prolonged sympathetic system for a long period of time, that's where mind-body symptoms can start to take place for people. Because what's happened is you're stuck in survival mode for too long. And we're not meant to be there for that long as human beings. We're meant to have a challenge, take action, and then move back up to ventral-vagal, safe and connected. That's what, theoretically we're meant to do. But in our society, the way it's kind of developed, we get caught in survival mode. And even for myself, when we talk about like perfectionists, I was a big perfectionist. I still have to work on it a bit now and then, but that's what's happening. Perfectionism just puts you in this fight or flight mode constantly, where you're constantly taking action and doing more and doing more. And it causes great dysregulation. And that's why it's so associated with mind-body issues. Now, what'll
Well,
happen?
yeah.
Yeah, go
Well,
ahead.
and to your point on neuroception, right? That those systems aren't necessarily going to be able to differentiate between the stress caused by being cut off in traffic and a situation that actually needs a quick action for survival.
Yeah,
And so is that why in our kind of in modern society this is even more of an issue that more and more people are living in this sympathetic state?
I think so. You
Mm.
know, we have a big drive to be productive in our society. It's highly valued. You know, being at ease and calm, it's not valued that much, unfortunately. It really isn't. And for myself, I've fallen victim to that many times. Even after I recovered, there was points where I got back into that pattern, and it's a really dangerous one because, and it can feel normal for people. That's the other thing that can be hard to see. There were times where I look back now and I was on high alert for years, just for years, pushing more and more in my career and my personal life. And it becomes so normal that we're not even aware of it. Because the first step while I'm explaining these is we need to be aware where we're at. If we don't know where we're at consistently and we can't notice and name what system we're in, it's just disorganized. We feel very disorganized. We don't know why, we don't feel good inside that. Because usually when you're in sympathetic long enough, you're not going to feel good. We just can't really put our finger on why that's taking place. And so the first thing for people listening is being able to notice and name what system you're in. That's a skill that Deb Dana tells people to do consistently. It doesn't take long, but it's just pausing, attending to your body, noticing what's taking place, and being able to notice and name where you're at. Now, what'll happen for a lot of people if you're in the sympathetic system long enough, and this could go on for years, for some people it only goes on for days, and you can't deal with the challenge, we go to the final system. And this is the dorsal vagal system. Now, the ventral vagal system and the dorsal vagal system, they're both part of this parasympathetic. They're both basically your vagus nerve. And your vagus nerve, it's running from like the base of your skull to all your major organs in your body and up into your face. Now, but there's two pathways to it. There's the ventral vagal where you're safe and connected, but the dorsal vagal is where we are detecting, your nervous system is detecting extreme cues of danger. And so what will happen is people will go here and they become immobilized with fear. They collapse, they shut down. And this is where a lot of people will feel depression, despair, hopelessness, helplessness. And again, if you're here for a prolonged period of time, that's where mind-body symptoms start to take place. If you think about animals in the wild, they go into dorsal vagal. So for example, if a deer was being chased by a cougar, let's say, okay, if the deer thought it couldn't get away, it could play dead. And what it's doing is it's going into dorsal. It's shutting down. Now, if the cougar gets bored and leaves, it's going to get back up, shake it off, and move on. So we're not meant to be there for this prolonged period of time. But the problem is that when we have mind-body symptoms, we go to this dorsal vagal place really easily. And we can live there. Like when I was in widespread chronic pain, I spent a lot of time in this system by the end, because when we can't find an answer to our symptoms, like the treatments aren't working, everything starts to feel hopeless. We feel helpless to do anything to change our situation. It's really easy to fall into that and be there. And we're just getting constantly more and more dysregulated and feel in danger of all sensations in our body. And so that's what can take place for a lot of people with chronic pain, chronic illness, is we end up in this place. And, it's possible to shift out. I want to give hope to that. It really is. But, it starts by doing different techniques to start to regulate the nervous system.
Yes. So one thing I want to just loop back on before we start segging into what we can do about this and how to start developing this, I guess, state awareness that you were talking about.
Yeah.
So one of the questions I really wanted to know the answer to is whether people are even aware of being in these states to begin with before they develop chronic symptoms. Because a frequent question I get is, hey, I wasn't in fight or flight. Life was going great. I wasn't stressed out. Although I think maybe about half of my viewers can look back and say, that was the worst period of my life. It makes total sense that this happened to me. A lot of people don't feel that way. They're like, everything was going fine. So how could this possibly happen to me? How can you tell me that this is stress or trauma related?
Yeah.
So how does it happen that people aren't picking up on these cues? I mean, it seems like it would be something obvious from the outside. If I'm in fight or flight, that my heart's pounding and that I have obvious signs of anxiety. Is that true? Like, would people necessarily know that they're in those states?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a difficult one because you're right. There are people where they can look back and be like, well, that was a terrible time in my life. It totally makes sense that my mind-body issues took place at this time.
Mm-hmm.
Other people aren't able to pick that up. So there's a number of different things that can take place, of course. You know, sometimes some type of injury or illness happens to the body and then it passes, but then people have gotten so dysregulated because of the symptoms, it continues on. So I do see that take place as well that I want to mention.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you're right that a lot of times we lack the insight to see that. So for myself, I'll give myself as the example. I can be really intense. I really can. I know that about myself now. In my early 20s, I didn't really notice that I was intense. Looking back, my partner, Anne, she can be like, whoa, you were intense back then. But I wasn't that aware of it. And what I mean by intensity is I was very much in this fight or flight, like always being excessively productive, perfectionistic, pushing forward at all costs. And I think what happens in our society a lot of the time is we're so disconnected from our body. We're so very disconnected. And in our society, we have so many ways of doing this. We can stay on our phone constantly, just be on electronics. We can excessively work. We can excessively eat. For some people, they use drugs or alcohol. For other people, they shop excessively. But we have all these ways to not connect to our felt sense. We have all these ways that people just use as avoidances and defenses. And I know Dr. Schubiner talks about this lots. Avoidances and defenses. People aren't aware that they're doing those very much. When I think back in my early 20s, I always give the silly example. I'm an angry cleaner. To be honest, I hate cleaning. I don't like it. But what would happen is I would get angry about something and I would just clean my entire house, like very particularly. And it's a silly one, but that was me avoiding my emotional state. That was me being like, I'm not going to feel this and I'm just going to clean. And I was just doing that behavior without awareness. And I think that's what happens with people is they become so disconnected that they're not even aware they're in a state of constant fight or flight. I think with the dorsal vagal, what can happen, which is a little bit different, we can be very dissociative when we're in that zone. Like for a lot of people that have had an overwhelming event and their nervous system goes into a trauma response, it shuts down, it collapses, and they dissociate. And even with chronic pain and symptoms, that happens too. We start to dissociate. When I was at the worst of it, like I would sit in front of the TV, like barely move. And I wasn't really watching TV, but for hours a day, I was just dissociating, trying to disconnect from everything. And so that's what takes place for a lot of people is there's this great disconnection. And that's why we need to get to know our nervous system because everyone's going to have a place that they call home base. You know, everyone has a place they call home base. For that drummer that I talked about earlier in my old band, he was often in Ventral-vagal. He was having a great time. Maybe even when he shouldn't have been there, but he was having a great time. That was his home base. I can say that definitively about that guy. For me, I've spent a lot of time in the sympathetic and dorsal, but I think the sympathetic system, I can just like click into that so easily in the past. And I had to do a lot of work to bring in more of that ventral vagal safe and connected energy. And I had to be really insightful of that taking place, because my nervous system can just lock into that really easily if I'm not careful. And so you're right, like there is this disconnection from our body where we're not even taking cues anymore until we get extreme symptoms. And then we're really listening. Then we're really aware of what's taking place.
Yeah. Yep. And Tanner, same thing for me with my mind body symptoms. My baseline was also high performing, right? And
yeah,
I had no idea. I just had absolutely no idea. They felt like they came out of nowhere. Now, with the perspective I have now, I understand, but I get where people are coming from. I think you and I can both get that. But I think what you're saying is one of our big jobs here in helping people recover is helping them create a new baseline. It's helping them not live in the red zone anymore.
Yeah. 100%. And the starting place is awareness. There needs to be somatic awareness of where we're at, of what's taking place. Even when we talk about emotional work, there needs to be somatic awareness of how we're feeling in our body.
Ooh,
because
so hard for people.
And because without that, without building that, and that takes time. When we've lived neck up for so long, it took me a long time, and I'm still working at it. Truly, it took a long time to start connecting to the body again. But like I said, that notice and name skill, it's a simple thing of like noticing where you're at, like taking an understanding of what's going on with my thoughts, what's going on with my body, what sensations are happening, and where do I think I am at on this hierarchy of the autonomic nervous system? Because that's the starting place. If people aren't aware that they're in fight or flight, and that happens, I promise you, as we've been talking about, there are points even recently where I'll be on high alert for a day and only at the end of the day be like, oh, like this is what's taking place. So I've gotten much quicker with it, but it does happen. And so the more awareness we can build, the better. And then we know what we may need to actually shift and be more in a safe and connected place.
So can you walk me through this just step by step for people who want to try this now? How would someone start practicing awareness of the states and get familiar? It sounds like you might need to familiarize yourself first with what the states feel like for you.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the starting place, is starting to identify, and map out what each system looks like for you. Because I'm explaining it generally here.
Sure.
But at first we need to do that. And so a really useful technique, and I want people to be careful, like don't dive in if you don't think it's accessible for you. But a really useful way to do this is thinking of a time when you remember clearly being in sympathetic and fight and flight. It's just like, it's thinking about that time.
And it could be a small example. Like they don't have to go back to their worst trauma. They can go to,
no, this is,
I couldn't find my phone the other day.
This is bringing a flavor of it on. I want to be clear with people, because if you go and dive in, it's going to be too much. You're just bringing a flavor of it on, visualizing that for a moment, and then notice what's happening in your body. What happens to your heart rate? What happens to your breathing? What sensations start to take place? What emotions do you start to feel? Even noticing what happens to your thoughts. Deb Dana talks about, like, what do you think about yourself right now? What do you think about the world? What do you think about your physical symptoms? Like, that's how you start to build this awareness. And you could repeat that for each of the three systems. And then you have a bit of a map of, okay, this is what this tends to look like some of the time for me. And that way, as you go about your day, you can take note, you can pause for a second, scan your body, notice what's happening with sensations, your breathing, your heart rate, your thoughts, and you start to understand, okay, where am I at? That's how we start to build this over time.
So maybe thinking of it like a map, like a little bit of a map for yourself of what each of these looks like. And
exactly.
Thinking of some examples. So ventral-vagal examples would be a time when you just felt loved and cared for, like when you were with someone you loved, like your grandma or a beloved pet even, right? That could look like ventral-vagal. And then for shutdown, do you have some specific examples of that? Because I can think of some like that would be maybe not so threatening, like, you know, when you've had a really long day and you're really tired and you just want to sit on your phone and just scroll, and like that feeling like, I don't want to deal with any of you. I just want to, would that be an example of dorsal vagal?
Yeah. You know, dorsal vagal, you want to be careful, kind of like you're saying, because you don't want to go too far into it because it can feel really extreme. But it could be a time where you just started to feel some despair about something, or you just started to feel a little bit helpless with your work situation. Like picking those times and noticing what shifts in your body. Because that's going to look very different from sympathetic.
Yeah.
There still can be fear in dorsal vagal, but you're more immobilized. You're more immobilized, shut down, dissociative. And dissociation, kind of like the example you just give, we do that. Sometimes we just blankly watch TV because we're just like shutting off. And it's noticing, okay, how do I experience this in my body? What does this look like?
Yeah, not the TV watching itself, but what's actually like, what are you numbing? Like you're numbing out. So what does the numbing out feel like? Yeah. Those are really good examples. Thank you. I just wanted to clarify for people who aren't sure what to use. Okay. So when we've built these maps, then what do people then do with them? So they have this sense now of what those three different states look like for them. What's next for them?
So the next place, and this is, well, there's a lot of techniques that could come next.
Sure.
There's a lot of techniques that could come next, and they're going to look a little bit different person to person. The next place is we're basically building up, you know, what are the resources you can use when you're in a sympathetic system or the dorsal vagal system to shift back up to ventral. And those are going to look a little bit different depending on where you're at. And so, you know, for example, like I teach certain breathing techniques. Now, a really simple way to start to regulate your system is breathing. And when we practice it, you know, I always tell people, you don't have to do it. This is the technical version. You don't have to do this. But even with breathing, if you breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth, and you make that exhale longer each time, that's what's going to help activate and tone your vagus nerve. And that's what's going to help your system shift. So sometimes I'll teach certain breathing techniques. For other people, it can be things like yoga or qigong that's polyvagal informed, where you're pairing movement with the breathing. It's a way that we can regulate our system. And it can work really, really well for a lot of people. You know, personally myself, I do a lot of qigong. This is something about me. I'm training right now to be a qigong teacher. This is another like side project I'm doing in the midst.
Well, great. We'll have you back on the channel to teach that too.
Yeah,
a little demonstration.
A little routine. But those are different ways you can help yourself shift. Now, another really simple thing that I talk about, Yonit, that can be beneficial is we talk about ventral vagal anchors. So what anchors us there? And that's going to be different than what you might think anchors you there. Again, it's neuroception. It's not perception. So what you cognitively think is going to create safety may not actually create safety in your body. And so when you're exploring ventral vagal anchors, you're going off of how your nervous system feels around a certain thing. It's a felt sense. It's not, I cognitively think talking or connecting with this one person is going to create safety, because it may not. So don't get too lost in the cognitive.
And that's why people, those lists, when they're like, well, call a loved one, talk to a friend. I mean, not that those things are bad, but as you said, it doesn't necessarily produce the same response for different people. It's not necessarily going to shift your nervous system.
Exactly. And so when we talk about ventral vagal anchors, we talk about the who, what, when, and where. Because all these different things, as Debbie going to talk about, can potentially shift you to a place, shift you to a safe and connected place. Think about the who. There's certain people in my life that will shift me there very easily. There's other people that won't. It doesn't mean they're bad friends or bad family members. They're just not the person I'm going to call and connect with when I'm maybe in a high sympathetic place. There's another clinician at my therapist, super relaxed guy, calm, at ease. When I have a work problem, he's the first person I call. Because what's happening is my nervous system is starting to co-regulate together based off one another. And that's an anchor for me. If I have a work problem, that's someone I call. I'm a big, on my YouTube channel, I have lots of videos with my cats, but I'm a big animal lover, and I just got a puppy. I have a lot of animals in my house. Animals will,
which may shift you into sympathetic mode temporarily.
Temporarily, yeah.
Being on the floor, yes.
The puppy, there's been some sympathetic moments, but there's times where it can shift me to ventral vagal. So I can use these as an anchor. And those are some of the who's that can shift me. Then we talk about the what. Like, what shifts you to that safe and connected place? That's going to be different person to person. It could be the breathing that I just described, and that was a really simple explanation. There's lots of different breathing techniques. For some people, it's yoga. For some people, it's qigong. For some people, it's being in nature and going for a walk. But you want to start to identify, okay, what are my anchors here? Because then you can start to use them more frequently. When you've identified, okay, I'm in sympathetic right now, or I'm in dorsal, what's an anchor I can use that's going to help shift me to a safe and connected place?
And I really love how you're describing this, because first of all, it's personalizing this for the person, which I think is very important. I personally would be quite insulted if I were suffering from chronic dizziness and they're like, oh, just, go for a walk outside and pet your dog. It's not about the thing you're doing. It's about using this, as you're saying, as a nervous system tool. And it seems to me that when you're describing this, although we're saying this is a bottom up approach, and it seems to me that it's also critical for there to be a cognitive mindfulness, an awareness that this is what we're doing, to frame it that way, so that I would assume this would make it more effective as well. That I am doing this to care for myself, to help my nervous system feel safe, versus I'm going for a walk in nature because they said I'm supposed to.
Yeah. Like you're intentionally doing things and you're going to feel it. Like even when we talk about the who's that anchor you, when I think about certain people in my life, I feel it. Like there's a feeling of that person creates safety when I think of them. But it's same with the whats. These could be all sorts of different things. I'll give you a really simple example. I'm a busy guy. After work, I have to take care of my kids. One thing I learned that my nervous system really likes is if I can go for a shower and just relax and do some breathing after I get home, before I go and feed my kids and have kid, puppy, cat chaos, I'm much more regulated. Again, it doesn't cognitively make sense. We can't really explain that, but my nervous system just takes the cue of safety from that. And it makes a big difference in my system. And so I like what you said, like it is personalized, right? And just to finish off, it's the where and when. So like where there's certain places that will do this for you. It could be a coffee shop. It could be a certain chair in your house. It could be sitting on your back deck. It could be in nature. But there's certain places that will probably shift you to more of a safe zone.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then,
Yes.
yeah.
Go ahead. You finish, and then I have a question.
And then the when.
The when.
So it could be certain times of day. Like for
Mm-hmm.
myself in the morning, I'm more often in ventral. I just am.
Mm-hmm.
At night, when I have kid, puppy, cat chaos, I'm less likely in that zone. I have to put more effort there. But when you're there, then you can lean into that because
Mm-hmm.
we're teaching your brain and nervous system to be in this system more often. And so once you use an anchor, then you want to savor being there because we're trying to teach our system to shift there with more ease. And overall, this is going to help regulate your nervous system and give cues of safety.
Mm-hmm.
And when we talk about when, I even sometimes have people visualize their favorite memory. It could be a pastime, like visualizing a memory when you're feeling dysregulated that really makes you feel safe and at ease and carefree. It can shift people in a pretty major way.
Yeah. Yeah. So the question I can just hear buzzing through all the minds of all the people watching. What if they never feel safe? Like, what if they're so scared and they're so uncomfortable with the symptoms that they have that they're not really able to get into this state? Does it still count even if they get just like a little taste of safety when they're imagining it? Does that still matter?
Yes, it does. 100%. And I think that's a good question and a common one that I hear is especially when we've been in dorsal vagal and shut down for so long, it can be really hard to even notice the little moments we're in ventral. And that's why there has to be this awareness, this embodied awareness of what's going on, because everyone will have moments. They're not going to be super long. It could be 30 seconds, but we need to start taking and understanding those moments and what got us there and how we can continue to give our nervous system that.
Yes.
So it can be really small 30-second, minute moments where you anchor yourself in a safe and connected place and then you savor being there.
Mm-hmm. And to clarify, this isn't focusing on the positive and trying to say, oh, everything's great.
Yeah.
It's not that. It's just experiencing what it's like to be safe. And as you're saying, savoring it to strengthen those neural pathways so that the brain has more awareness of what it's like to be there. And there's also, again, not just an awareness, but a reinforcement that like attention wise that you want to be there.
Yeah. And I think it's a good point because we want to be careful. You don't want it to be toxic positivity. That's not what we're going for.
Thank you. Yes.
It's not useful. And you're not always going to be in ventral. That's not the point. No. We're just giving our nervous system practice. And, I've made it really simple as we talked that there's 3 systems. They're not in silos. There's a combination. So when we're regulating the nervous system, when Peter Levine talks about this, homeostasis, what's taking place with homeostasis is we're basically getting to a place where there's balance, where our nervous system starts to have a nice flow that's taking place. And so we can have the non-defense, this is complicated, but we can have the non-defense reactions of the sympathetic and of the dorsal. So all sympathetic isn't bad. Sympathetic regulates our heart rate. It regulates our breathing. It regulates our body temperature. The dorsal vagal, it regulates our digestive system. And so we need to be able to, in our system, tolerate having lots of energy and then also having less energy. That's the idea. So it's not like we're just trying to be calm all the time. We want it to get to a place where people feel safe in all these places. But how we do that is we bring in some ventral vagal energy into that. We do a similar thing. Sorry, go ahead. I was saying we do a similar thing with emotions, right? With emotions, what we're trying to get to with people is so that they're in ventral vagal as they're experiencing difficult things. That's how we create a sense of safety in the body as emotions are happening. You know, suppressing your emotions, that's not going to regulate your nervous system. That's going to dysregulate things more. So we need to learn to approach emotions, experience them, and release them, as Schubiner talks about in his model that I know you utilize as well. Mm-hmm. That's what we're going for as we do this.
Mm-hmm. So would it be useful then to think of this, to frame this by saying it's not about trying to spend lots and lots of time in ventral vagal, or that isn't the goal you want to really be thinking about. It's if you go into it using an anchor and then you shift back into sympathetic, that's perfect. Now you're also building your maps of how different these states are and building your awareness and ability to recognize when you're in each. So that's still valuable, right?
It's still valuable. The awareness is there, and that's going to build. That's going to build more and more over time. It's not just going to be a place you arrive at. Mm-hmm. The awareness builds more and more. But we do need to give our nervous system more capacity to be in ventral vagal. Mm-hmm. Because if we can be there more consistently, or at least have some of that energy taking place in our system and be aware of it, that's where mind-body symptoms can start to dissipate for mm-hmm. us.
Mm-hmm. So that actually, backing up for just a second, because I have more questions about what you just said, but I just want to clarify something else. So since we have these three states, and it seems like we would have to shift in order to get to ventral vagal from dorsal vagal, we might shift via sympathetic. So in other words, if we're in a state of shutdown, would it make sense for people to temporarily feel more anxiety and more activation before they get to a calm and connected place?
Yeah, you're right. So that's why they're in a hierarchy, because you're not just going to jump from dorsal up to ventral. That's not going to take place. Like you need to bring energy back into your system. And we want to do that in a more positive way. But even for myself, I've learned that if I ever start to feel low, I need to start moving my body in some way. Mm-hmm. And that's hard when we have chronic symptoms. So I do empathize with people. I've been there. Mm-hmm. But there needs to be some type of movement, getting more stimulation taking place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. So is this, and this is just totally hypothetical, but do you think this explains why sometimes, because this has actually come up a lot, why sometimes people with dizziness, as they're starting to get better, they start to notice more of that activation in their bodies? Like they were just totally frozen in dizziness for however long they were just and completely not, I wouldn't say distracted by it, but all their attention was on that. They start to lose their fear of it. Things start getting better. And then suddenly they're noticing all these physical symptoms, as I said, of what they would call physical symptoms of anxiety, like heart pounding. They're noticing more of that, racing thoughts, some of the other things we associate with that. Do you think that explains why that happens?
Yeah, it's an interesting question.
I'm sure there are multiple ways to think about it. I'm just wondering, as you were saying this, I was thinking, wow, that really explains this.
As you were saying, I was thinking there's lots of ways to explain it. Mm-hmm. You know, one thing that I really like about Schubiner's approach when we mm-hmm. talk about this is there's anger expression. That's a big part of emotional awareness and expression therapy. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And why I think it's really effective. And when I was recovering, I actually did quite a bit of that and read his book and did a lot of that work. One thing that it benefits people is when you're in dorsal and you're so shut down and hopeless and helpless, anger helps you move through sympathetic.
Yes.
And at the end of kind of more his emotional process, we get to this compassionate place where we're back in ventral. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what Schubiner thinks about this, but I think there is an element that's very insightful of how that plays out. Mm-hmm. So kind of similar to your question, like I think that is potential. I think there's multiple ways to think about it. But hypothetically, I think with that emotional processing, I think that's what's partly taking place when people express anger. They're shifting out of dorsal. Mm-hmm. They're moving, they're releasing that energy. and then they're able to move back up to ventral.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that can take place. There's a number of ways we could do that, but I think that is a hypothetical thing that's probably taking place for some people.
Yeah. 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 And maybe just one way to think about it, but seems to be, you and I have both seen this
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
people. You see, you can see it happening, the state change.
Yeah.
So coming back to what you were saying about finding ways to shift yourself through these states, a question people are going to be asking is, how often should they be practicing this? Like, is this an all day thing? Is this a once a day thing? Like what does the routine look like? Which I know is impossible to answer, but do your best because
Yeah.
I know they're going to ask.
It's a hard one because everyone's nervous system is different in what they need. And, we have some basic ideas, but it is going to be different person to person. It's typically not something that we can practice once a day. Even on my channel, like I have, for people's reference, because we didn't cover it fully today, I have a video on like 5 breathing techniques to regulate the nervous system, where I go through 5 breathing and movement techniques that really have that extended exhale. That's not something you could practice 5 minutes a day and expect to be more regulated and flexible in your system. Even for myself, I practice that every day, but it's consistently throughout the day. Some people do it in smaller doses. Some people do longer 10, 15-minute somatic practices in this way. So I think gives you an idea of what needs to happen here. Even with the anchors, it's not like you can just anchor once a day in ventral-vagal and expect there to be a change. Like there needs to be this consistency, because when we think about, one thing that I learned from Deb Dana during a training is she was saying at the end of the day, we all have the sense if it's like a good or bad day, right? We all have the sense of like, oh, that was a good day. Oh, that was a pretty crappy day. I didn't like that day. Like we have the sense. All that's happened is this equation's taken place on, is your nervous system picked up more cues of safety within the day, or has it picked up on more cues of danger? And so we're not going to force our system to shift, but if we can give it cues of safety consistently throughout the day with different anchors, for example, that's going to make a big difference overall in terms of, the resiliency of our nervous system.
Can you say a word about outcome independence here in regards to symptoms?
Outcome independence. Yeah. That's an important one. It's an important one because,
well, especially in regards to what you're talking about, because people can be like, I did the breathing and nothing happened.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. We talk about outcome independence. It's not having the desired outcome, at least in the short run. Long term, why everyone's listening to either of our channels or this video for a good reason is they want their symptoms to go away. And I get that. But all that pressure and intensity and high alertness that we bring to any practice, it's just going to sink us. And I always talk about with people, what's more important is the attitude we bring to the practice than exactly what we're doing. Even when we think about a technique like somatic tracking, I've seen people do somatic tracking where it's not even somatic tracking. I'm like, you're not doing it right, but they had the right attitude with it. They had this genuine ease and lightness that they were cultivating, and it worked. Like it worked well over time.
Right.
So it goes to show it's more about the attitude when we're bringing these things than about the exact technique. And that's a hard thing to cultivate. That's not going to happen like instantaneously. But I always talk about with people that we need to focus on safety. Let's focus on building safety in all the different ways that we've talked about today. And then over time, let's see how your symptoms behave. And then that way it takes the pressure off a bit. It's just, we're going to focus on building safety in all these different ways, cognitively, somatically, behaviorally. We're going to focus on creating safety in all these different ways within your life. And let's see how your symptoms respond over time. I think it's a useful way to kind of break that up and have that outcome independence with things.
That's really a good, I love that. That's a good point. And so ways of creating safety. I mean, in this conversation, we've focused very much on kind of this bottom-up approach. We've talked about the cognitive approach, but you touched a little bit on some of the emotional work and how that helps create safety as well. I mean, you mentioned it in the context of you need safety in order to do emotional work, but can you say anything about how feeling your emotions, being able to be honest with yourself about your needs and internal experiences can also help move people into this ventral vagal state?
Yeah, of course. When we talk about emotions, like when we suppress emotions, what happens in our nervous system is we become increasingly dysregulated. I've experienced it many times. I'm a person that I need to work on this even consistently to this day. They don't happen naturally for me. I've had to really work and go with the flow of feeling my emotions. But when we suppress or resist emotions, the reason that that can trigger mind body symptoms is it causes just chronic dysregulation in your system, where people get caught in this high sympathetic or dorsal place because they're suppressing important emotions, important needs that they need to feel, that they need in their life. And that's a great thing from EAET that they talk about, is like we have these important feelings and we have these important needs that we all have as human beings. And if we start to resist or avoid those long enough, your brain and nervous system is just going to start to produce these inhibiting symptoms of pain, fatigue, dizziness, tinnitus, other mind-body issues. Mm-hmm. And so that's how I understand it in terms of the nervous system. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to where we started today, is the goal isn't to just always be calm. That's not the goal.
It's not. Yeah.
The goal is so that, even this morning when I was angry and forgot my wallet and like rushing around, I took time as I was driving home to let myself feel that. It wasn't extreme anger, but there was irritation. And I'm able to approach that and experience that without trying to avoid it, without trying to make it go away. And that way I was able to move through my emotions. They increased, they peaked, and then they eventually faded. And then I was able to shift up to a safe place. But I needed to move through that. Now that's going to be hard with bigger emotions, but that's the idea that we're going for.
And anyone who's needs a further example of that, think about the last time you cried, and how on the other side of crying, often people feel a sense of relief. It's actually these adaptive emotions are adaptive for a reason. They're here to give you data, and once you have the data, it's your nervous system is getting a signal that you got the message. You got the message, and there's safety in you having received the message. It's given you the signal, and now you've gotten the signal. We're good. You're safe, right? Now that you've had it. So, again, that's just another example. I like the anger one though, because I think, as we haven't talked about this so much, but in EAET, we sure do, that certain people have difficulties feeling certain emotions. So not everyone has trouble feeling anger. Not everyone has trouble feeling sadness, but in many cases, people are going to have more difficulty feeling one than the other.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. It is individual. Everyone has different emotions they resist. It can even be things that we view as, I don't like the term, but positive emotions, like feeling love or joy.
Very, very true. Mm-hmm.
Those can feel really dangerous to people, and then we push them down, and we don't allow ourselves to feel that. That's gonna trigger symptoms too. Like those are important feelings we need as well. Mm-hmm. And so, we haven't. That's a whole other topic.
I know. I know. I feel like we could have a whole conversation about that. I just wanted to put that in the context of safety, creating safety.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. So, okay. So tell me, if you wouldn't mind, as we wrap up our conversation, how have people with dizziness that you've worked with responded to using techniques like these? Has this worked for people with dizziness? Is this something that people can put into action, knowing that it can actually help them?
Yeah. And when I think about it, with all my body symptoms, dizziness included, there can be really good results. And my job as a therapist is exploring different techniques. We talked about polyvagal theory today. That's part of what I focus on with people. It's not the whole picture, but it's part of it for sure. And, I explore different ways of doing different things to create safety and regulate the nervous system. And by doing that, I have seen good results that can take place for people. I have seen good results where it dissipates completely.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is possible. Like, I want to give that message of hope that this can be an important thing to include kind of in your mind-body healing that can really benefit symptoms reducing or being eliminated over time.
Wonderful. So if someone wanted to learn more or put some things into practice immediately, any resources that they could use?
Yeah. So on my YouTube channel, it's just my name, Tanner Murtagh, MSW.
And I'll link to it.
Yeah, you'll link to it. But they can check that out. I have lots of, very practical things that people could go on, education strategies people can try out. Some of it polyvagal stuff, some of it EAET stuff, some of it PRT, but there's a mix of stuff there that people could check out. There's free resources. I have a podcast too that I do with my partner, Anne, called The Mind Body Couple. And it's just a different format, but there's lots of content there as well, and techniques and strategies.
I'll get the link from you for that as well and put that in the description. Yeah. Wonderful. Any books that you can recommend? Like, I know there's some workbooks out there. Anything that you've found has been helpful or not so much?
Yeah, there's lots of books. I find, I forget the name, but Deb Dana has a good breakdown of polyvagal theory. That I'm
pretty sure she has a workbook where it's like a whole book of just activities that you can do.
And it's super practical, and I think it can be really easy for people to apply it. So that can be really beneficial in terms of what we're talking about. And I think we've also talked about Dr. Schuberner's book, Unlearn Your Pain, which has a workbook. Lots of strategies there. I think it's like a 28-day program. What can be helpful, and I'm sure you've recommended like The Way Out, which is really pain reprocessing therapy by Alan Gordon, and that's a great resource as well for some of the stuff we talked about. So those are the main things that I would suggest to people early on.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. This was very helpful, and I'm so glad that you came in to talk about this, because in a 10-minute YouTube video, I will often use the word danger mode, or I'll sometimes use the word fight or flight, but that really doesn't describe what we're talking about. There's more nuance, and people now have a resource I can refer them to and say, hey, actually, this is where we break it all down. And you're, of course, an expert on the subject. So I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. And for those of you watching or listening, if you're watching on YouTube, please leave a comment or question. If you have one, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. And if you're listening to this as a podcast, if you could follow the podcast and leave a rating, that would also really help me reach more people. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Tanner. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.